A large force of the Iraqi army surrendered to American troops and their Kurdish allies. Something has happened to Saddam Hussein or his two sons. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld is heading to Camp David. The President's top military and national security advisors have been summoned to the mountaintop retreat. Iraqis are short of food, medicine, and clean water. Arabs are about 65% of the population of Mosul. Mr. Fleischer was questioned about the final analysis of a videotape of Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein broadcast. Tensions have increased between Arabs and Kurds. Kurds might try to set up an independent state. The tape has been analyzed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Nobody would stand in the way of the humanitarian reconstruction of Iraq. Mosul is Iraq's third largest city. Tikrit is Saddam Hussein's hometown. Camp David is a quiet, remote location. Camp David is really an adjunct of the White House. The tape is indeed the voice of Saddam Hussein. Every modern communication is a marine facility. 45 countries are now members of the coalition. They do not seek independence. The end of Saddam Hussein's control does not lessen the dangers. They want to remain part of a united Iraq. American forces continue to face resistance. Even hospitals have been targets of stealing. Kurdish fighters would leave Kirkuk. Hospitals can receive medical supplies. Camp David has every modern communication. Many countries are supporting the U.S.-led military operation. We are making progress. Our objective is to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. We have achieved our objective. Those include Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Central Intelligence Director George Tenet, and Vice President Dick Cheney. Allied Kurdish troops captured the city Thursday. Mr. Bush meets later Saturday with members of his cabinet. Mr. Bush briefed congressional leaders on the war effort. The comments were made earlier in the day by French President Jacques Chirac. The capture of Mosul left Tikrit a remaining target. American officials declare the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein gone. The United Nations has a role in the future of Iraq and reconstruction of Iraq. The UN resolution is authorizing the administration of a post-war Iraq by the United States and Britain. The American forces take control of Kirkuk and the oil fields around it. Military officials promise to deal with anarchy in Baghdad and other cities. President Bush is staying in seclusion at his Camp David retreat. Camp David is nestled in the mountains of northern Maryland on the edge of a national forest. The path was set during the first Gulf War more than a decade ago. Mr. Fleischer was questioned about Saddam Hussein's broadcast after the first missile attack. Basra is the second largest city in Iraq. An American-led temporary government is expected to begin work in Baghdad within 2 weeks. Former President Bush also spent the first weekend after the start of hostilities at Camp David. President Bush is spending the weekend in seclusion at his Camp David retreat. The capture of Mosul left Tikrit a remaining target for American forces in the north. 5 bank robbers were reported killed Friday in a gun battle with British troops in Basra. This would set an example for the large Kurdish population across the border in southern Turkey. The path was set by his father during the First Gulf War more than a decade ago. Mr. Fleischer was questioned about the final analysis of a videotape of Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's broadcast 1 hour after the first missile attack on Thursday. The United States agreed to let Turkey send military observers to join American forces in that city. Kurds were permitted to remain in control. American forces moved to take control of Kirkuk and the oil fields around it. The International Red Cross urged coalition forces to return order in Baghdad. Turkey sent military observers to join American forces in that city. Arabs have entered Iraq to fight against the Americans. Their analysis has led them to believe that the United Nations will take part in the efforts to rebuild Iraq. Plans call for the team to organize aid programs. Mr. Bush briefed congressional leaders on the war effort before leaving the White House Friday. Mr. Chirac would oppose any UN resolution authorizing the administration of a post-war Iraq by the United States and Britain. The end of Saddam Hussein's control does not lessen the dangers faced by coalition troops or Iraqi civilians. Camp David is a quiet, remote location nestled in the mountains of northern Maryland on the edge of a national forest. Mr. Fleischer was also asked about comments made earlier in the day by French President Jacques Chirac. President Bush will follow the path set by his father during the First Gulf War more than a decade ago. President Bush has in many ways followed the path set by his father during the First Gulf War more than a decade ago. We have achieved our objective, which is to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. They can live in a society that is hopeful and democratic and at peace in its neighborhood. No one could still say for sure what has happened to Saddam Hussein or his 2 sons. The White House spokesman said number of countries supports the U.S.-led military operation. United States military officials say a large force of the Iraqi army surrendered to American troops and their Kurdish allies. Officials say Arabs have entered Iraq to fight against the Americans. The Bush administration has said the United Nations will take part in efforts to rebuild Iraq. He said Operation Iraqi Freedom is proceeding well. The President does believe the United Nations has a role in the future of Iraq and reconstruction of Iraq. Kurdish political leaders say they do not seek independence. Presidential spokesman Ari Fleischer says it is really an adjunct of the White House. Some reports suggested that members of his family might be hiding there. Turkey fears that Kurds might try to set up an independent state. Secretary of State Colin Powell promised that Kurdish fighters would leave Kirkuk. The fear is that this would set an example. I would hope that nobody would stand in the way of the humanitarian reconstruction of Iraq. Turkey threatened to intervene if Kurds were permitted to remain in control. No conclusions have been reached about whether it was canned ahead of time or not. We will stay on task until we have achieved our objective. Coalition forces should return order in Baghdad so hospitals can receive medical supplies. We will free the Iraqi people so they can live in a society that is hopeful and democratic and at peace in its neighborhood. Camp David has everything that everyone needs. President Bush is spending the weekend at his Camp David retreat where he meets later Saturday with his members of his cabinet. There was theft and disorder in the city. There was also lawlessness in the South. Also in the north, American forces moved to take control of Kirkuk and the oil fields around it. As of Friday, after more than 3 weeks of war, no one could still say for sure what has happened to Saddam Hussein or his 2 sons. Before leaving the White House Friday, Mr. Bush briefed congressional leaders on the war effort. So far during this conflict, President Bush has in many ways followed the path set by his father during the first Gulf War more than a decade ago. During a brief session with reporters, Mr. Fleischer was questioned about the final analysis of a videotape of Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's broadcast just hours after the first missile attack on Thursday. American officials on Friday declared the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein gone. Iraqi soldiers in the northern city of Mosul surrendered Friday. People in Mosul celebrated. Kurds in northern Iraq might try to set up an independent state. American forces in Iraq continue to face resistance. Arabs from other countries have entered Iraq to fight against the Americans. The number of countries supporting the U.S.-led military operation continues to grow. Those heading to Camp David include Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Central Intelligence Director George Tenet, and Vice President Dick Cheney. Plans call for the team to organize aid programs and work to rebuild the capital and set up a democratic government. It is a marine facility and has everything that anybody needs. And their analysis has led them to believe that the tape is indeed the voice of Saddam Hussein, but no conclusions have been reached about whether it was canned ahead of time or not. Military officials promised to deal with anarchy in Baghdad and other cities, but war efforts moved north. The United Nations will take part in efforts to rebuild Iraq, but will not lead them.